I was asked to come down and talk about the issue of water resources. Folks here in Texas have been very acutely aware of the diminishing availability of water in this country. You know, in your state here, for example, and the state has been doing some very proactive planning, you know, bottom-up planning in order to try to address a lot of the water resources issues here in the state. I just want to acknowledge that right up. However, I'm not going to focus really so much on Texas and all the good things. I want to, if anything, take that step back and get up to maybe about 50,000 feet and take a look at the issue from a more of a national perspective, what we are seeing in Washington, some of the good, bad, and the ugly, I guess, of issues that we see percolating related to water resources. And when I say water resources, my discussion today is going to be focusing both on the water quantity side, you know, having adequate amounts of water for our various types of uses in our society, but also going to take a little bit of a look at the water quality issues. And that's really important because at the end of the day, I think that water quantity is going to be driving water quality types of programs, for example, under the Federal Clean Water Act. That's going to be driving things in the future, and is going to have a tremendous ripple effect on many aspects of how regulatory programs look at the federal and state levels, and also other allied requirements that may potentially get imposed on people in the future. And to the extent that people, you know, stakeholders on the outside are proactive in trying to address these issues, like the state of Texas is making an attempt to do through its state water planning process, that that'll foreclose the need for, you know, or the push for a lot of a heavier federal role, which people out in the states don't like, and you know, there's a need for having a very strong federal, not just federal role, but a state and local role. And when I say state and local, I don't mean just public, but I mean also the people that are in the states and at the local level who are the stakeholders on these issues. Anyway, let me get moving on this. This kind of summarizes the state of affairs where we are headed right now, and it's not just in the Southwest anymore, and I'll get into this more, but you know, we have seen skirmishes occurring in a lot of other areas. But let me move on. Charlie gave a good synopsis of you know, the civics lesson, you know, about where I am situated within the U.S. Congress, and I just threw this up real briefly. The one thing that I will mention with my subcommittee and committee, the main programs of jurisdiction that we have are under the Environmental Protection Agency, the Federal Clean Water Act, so we look at the water quality side of it, and we also look at a portion of the, what I'll call the water quantity side of things, with the Army Corps of Engineers Civil Works program. So that's also within our jurisdiction. One of the things that makes things very complicated in Congress is that jurisdiction over all of the federal water agencies. You know, it's not just the Corps of Engineers, but you have Bureau of Reclamation, for example. You have the U.S. Geological Survey as a science agency, and you have other federal agencies that are involved in water issues in one way or another. Even NRCS is involved in some respects. One of the difficulties at a congressional level and federal level is that you have these multiple agencies with multiple committees of jurisdiction overseeing them, and to try to coordinate things better, you know, between agencies and between committees, like say in the case of Congress, becomes extremely difficult, and that's going to be one issue that we're going to have to be dealing with in the future. Anyway. Water, I think needless to say, you know, as I mentioned on this slide here, is a key component to achieving prosperity and wealth in our economy. One of the things that made this country great early on was the availability of abundant natural resources, including water. And even in the West, where things are relatively dry as compared to the water-abundant East, in the early days, there was enough water to go around one way or another for people. But however, we're going to, this is no longer the situation that we're really under. This slide is touching on, as I already alluded to, the water quantity and water quality issues, how they're interrelated with each other. Another issue that's going to be continuing to play is the issue of jurisdiction over water. There has been legislation floating about in Congress over the past several years now, where there are those that have the view that all water should be federalized, and attempting to do this predominantly through the Federal Clean Water Act, and trying to expand jurisdiction, frankly, over to all wet areas. And there has been a tremendous pushback by water interests, and the pushback has been all that much stronger the further west you go in this country, to that push by some who have an interest in a very strong federal role in water resources in this country. Let me get into a little bit of background just for perspective, I guess, on this. As I have statistics up here, we have a lot of water in this world. However, much of it is not immediately usable for us, either because it is highly saline, like the oceans, or we have high salinity content, I'll call it brackish water, be it in groundwater and in a lot of cases even certain surface waters. Right now we have water locked in the ice caps, and there's really a small percentage of all those water molecules that exist in this country are freely available for our use, for our various types of uses. The United States overall is blessed with very abundant water resources. I have statistics up here about the amount of water that is usable, and a lot of it is surface water, partly aided through surface storage that we have around the country. And as I indicate near the bottom, that our current rate of water usage in this country is approximately 400 billion gallons a day. This is some statistics from a USGS report that gives you some indication of the breakdown on water usage. Note how some of the big uses here are, notice how, like in the lower right there, irrigation and agricultural, and landscaping types of activities accounts for roughly about 31% of the usage, based upon the latest water usage statistics that the U.S. Geological Survey has provided. And you can see the little down arrow there indicating that this percentage is actually decreasing, and it's decreasing fairly rapidly vis-a-vis, on a comparative basis to other types of water uses. Thermoelectric power has been another major user of water. Now, a lot of that is not, a lot of these uses have not been heavily consumptive uses, meaning you pull it out of the river or out of the ground and use it and it's gone. But most of these uses tend to be putting a significant proportion of that water back into the ground. There are also other totally in-stream uses that I want to point out, like navigation, hydroelectric power, recreational aquatic ecosystem maintenance. Some of these are becoming more and more emphasized, and I'm going to point to the recreational and aquatic ecosystem maintenance points that there are certain stakeholders out there, including some activist groups, that very heavily focus upon the ecosystem maintenance, having enough water for the fish and other critters in the water to continue surviving, which is an important issue, but and recreational usage of waters, and how and even if you're talking about managing dam releases, for example, trying to manage dam releases so you have whitewater for people to go kayaking or rafting, in whitewater types of streams. These are kinds of issues that have gained a lot of importance and have really had a tremendous impact on the way management agencies are able to manage their water resources. I've heard this from everything from the Corps of Engineers to the Tennessee Valley Authority, which, by the way, falls under our jurisdiction also, to a whole slew of other agencies in dealing with these kinds of issues. And there's been a lot of litigation around the country related to these kinds of uses. To the extent that you have to maintain water in a stream, that means there is that much less water that we have for a whole bunch of these other uses up there. So what's the point that we're really getting here? Is that we're not so abundant with our water resources anymore, and we are getting into a very complex situation when you look at our water supply sources, you look at the kinds of facilities that we have, and most importantly, when you look at all the many types of water users and competing water uses that exist in our nation today. And and I pointed out those statistics of the roughly 1,400 billion gallons a day being available to us versus the 400 billion gallons a day being actually used. The big problem is that supply and demand is not matching up very well anymore geographically, and that and water is no longer a free resource, but more and more it is becoming a resource of demand that people are competing for, and traditionally this has been a problem, in more water scarce parts of the country. I've certainly been hearing about West Texas, and I've been hearing about this in even drier parts of the country than here. Nevada, places like that, Arizona, just to use examples. I'm now hearing about it. I was up in the Pacific Northwest. People are worried about water in Oregon and Washington, and I don't mean east of the Cascades. I'm talking about places like city of Seattle. They're worried about their future water supplies. So, and more they're competing with, for example, the agricultural interests that exist, say, on the east side of the Cascades. So more and more, this is becoming a big issue, nationally. We heard about, the Atlanta drought situation and Lake Lanier drying up. Here we're talking about an area that has not traditionally been thought of as a dry climate type of area, but look what happened there. And so the issues are changing more and more. And it's going to only get worse rather than better unless we start looking ahead and doing things here. As I indicate on this slide, we have fast population growth in many areas, especially in a lot of the drier parts of the country. This is putting still more stress on the available resources of the area. I'm forgetting the exact statistics for here in Texas, but population over the next 50 years is, if I recall right, is roughly at least in the 1/3, if not 1/2, 50% maybe growth. I don't know if anybody has the statistic exactly. It's been a while since I read it, but tremendous growth is anticipated just in Texas alone. But people are tending to move more and more to the Sun Belt, and this is becoming more and more of an issue. Even Florida, you might think of as a very waterlogged state. It isn't anymore. And as I indicate on this slide, demand patterns are changing. It's interesting how irrigated acres in the west are decreasing and decreasing pretty tremendously. In the east, however, they are increasing. And now a lot of change that seems to be occurring with irrigated acres for agricultural related production in the West is going to much more efficient ways of irrigation. In the East, you see, like a good example, trickle irrigation. Comparatively speaking, you see very little of that being utilized in the East, but utilizing a lot of the more traditional means of either flood irrigation or sprinkler types of irrigation, including with the big circular irrigators that are more common on the eastern parts of the country. Raises issues of efficiency versus, say, cost, and what is the value of water. Always the economic kind of a theme that lurks there. We are dealing with, in some cases, pollutants in water, either man-made pollution, that is either contaminated surface or groundwaters, or we're dealing with, and that has an impact, remember, on the quality issue, like say under the Clean Water Act, and there's also the issue related to just natural pollution or natural unacceptable constituents in the water like salinity, which makes water unusable in many cases unless you do some kind of a treatment, be it desalination or whatever. Hey, let's throw, I mentioned already about flow maintenance requirements. Hey, let's throw in the climate change issue. I'm not going to get into the issue of what's causing it, but something certainly is happening. I think that's pretty clear. What kind of effects are we going to have that way? Lake Mead, because of the sustained drought that's been occurring out in the Southwest, Lake Mead has reached historic low levels just within, there was a big article about this, in all the many of the newspapers just no more than a couple of weeks ago. Historic low levels. The city of Las Vegas is tunneling to put in a water intake at a lower elevation in Lake Mead, because if the water elevation in Lake Mead drops much lower, and I forgot the exact number of feet, but it's pretty minimal, maybe like 10 more feet or so, their water intakes are going to be above the water line in the lake. And it's incredible. If you ever do a Google search of Lake Mead and look for a picture, and a modern picture, and you'll see the huge bathtub ring of all the dried up salts that are on the rocky slopes. And it's real impressive to see it. And then, there's the economic effects. How is that going to play into things as water becomes a more scarce resource and the cost of water goes up? This is going to be another factor that comes into play with respect to how we're going to be dealing with water. Water traditionally had been very, very cheap in this country, and we used it as if it was a free resource, a very, very abundant resource. Again, the paradigm that we're going to be operating under is going to be, is changing, and it's going to be really affecting how we're going to be doing things. I wanted to mention, like right here, that we are doing a lot of good things to try to increase conservation and reduce water usage, and that has been actually very effective over the last 10, 20 years to actually stabilize water usage in the U.S., and I have a couple of graphs I'll pull up real fast. I have a little statistic here on recycled water. This is one of the graphs that I pulled up here. This is from USGS as a source. If you look at total withdrawals, these are the green bar charts, you can see that water usage has actually stabilized in this country over the past, basically 25 years, roughly at that 400 billion gallons a day. The red line that is plotted there is the per capita usage, and you can see that it's actually been going down. This is partly, thanks to things like low-flow toilets and things of that nature, greater efficiencies that we're weaving in. However, where is it going to go in the future when we have some of these, the increasing population? You have new increasing kinds of demands that are going to be occurring. So these are some of the kinds of questions that we're going to be having to deal with in this country. And again, hats off to Texas. Most states are doing very little or nothing. Even in the East, the Mid-Atlantic had a very severe drought for about a year and a half in the in 2002, and ironically 2003 was almost a record wet year. But what was happening in just a relatively short amount of time, because of the lack of doing anything to deal with water resources, you had a lot of population growth in the Mid-Atlantic, and people have not taken care of their infrastructure related to water resources. In some cases, cities were running out of water because, like in one example, about 2/3 of the volume of their water supply reservoir filled up with sediment over the past 30, 40 years. Issues like this. People were asleep at the switch, and they continue to be asleep at the switch. And it was I was glad that we had a very wet year in 2003 because it helped my lawn. But it was very unfortunate because everybody started to ignore people. It was getting on people's radar screens in the East and in Washington because it was happening there. People were starting to listen to the issue of, hey, what's happening here, with water resources? What about drought? But then suddenly, we all have a short memory, and everybody forgot about it because it wouldn't stop raining in 2003. And since then, it's been kind of up and down. We've been getting into a mode of hot, dry summers, but pretty abundant rain in the wintertime. So it's been not hearing the big screams. We heard a regional issue down in the southeast, and I mentioned about Atlanta already, but that was a relatively limited area, and what happened, latter part of last year, it just rained like the dickens down there, and Lake Lanier went from almost empty to brimming full. So no, that's suddenly not an issue anymore. So it's this short-sightedness that is a real problem. And so what are a lot of the states doing or not doing? They're mostly not doing, and that's very, very unfortunate. And even with the economic situation today, it has shifted attention further away from these kinds of issues. And I'll just point out a fact that the Washington area right now stands pretty well with respect to water supply, including for water storage. Potomac River is a major water supply for the Washington D.C. region, and however, it is projected that within the next 20 to 25 years, that because of the anticipated population growth in the region, even without mega severe droughts, the Washington area is going to be having problems with water supply if we have even a moderately dry year. And the problem is we need to start planning today, but it ain't happening, folks. Okay. Part of the problem, and I had a little commentary on my previous slide. Here's a plot of showing the amount, number, and capacity of large reservoirs that have been completed by decade. And you could see that there was during the Depression era there was a big big amount of building going on. And notice how in the 1960 to 69, with a tail falling into the earlier what is really the early 70s, not the late 70s there was a major amount of supply reservoir building. The reason why is because back in the mid-60s, the Mid-Atlantic had about a 4 or 5 year drought. And that led to Congress passing legislation, Water Resources Planning Act, that threw a lot of money at the states to do a lot of water resource planning, and a lot of money was directed to this, and the states got very, very busy building water supply reservoirs, including those that are in the upper Potomac Basin for Washington, D.C. that I was mentioning about. And but since then, as I mentioned, out of sight, out of mind. Everybody stopped doing anything. They fell asleep at the switch again. Money got cut off ultimately, and then to compound the problem, there's a big, big opposition by some of the environmental activist groups that are adamantly opposed to storage types of infrastructure for water, and either in-stream or off-stream types of storage, and for various supposed environmental reasons. And the arguments that some of these activists make is that it's important to, of course, protecting the environment and critical resource, wildlife and the like. That's fine. And they emphasize conservation and greater efficiency, which is also fine, and I think we have a long ways that we can go in this country, as compared to what we're doing now. But we can only go so far, and there's going to be a day of reckoning. And what's increasingly going to happen is that people in this country are going to get caught with their proverbial pants down, because there's a very long lead time to be doing the planning that we need, and there's a very long lead time in order to build the kind of infrastructure, if we're talking infrastructure, and I think we are, to help give us the the adequate reserve that we need to be able to carry on in these dry periods, and to also meet the kinds of demands that we're going to see in the future. Here's a slide real quickly, just showing some of the areas of high population growth. A lot of it is not entirely, but a lot of it is in the Sun Belt regions. Now this diagram's a little bit old. If we take into account not just population movement, but increases in water demands, and we take into account some of the new demands that are going to be placed with energy production, as well as energy production in the way of, like, say, extraction of resources, as well as energy production in the way of be it power plants or renewable types of resources, even like, say, solar panels. If you have a solar array in the desert, you need water in order to operate that. That is going to help change some of these maps in terms of where there's going to be increasing areas of demand and how it fits or doesn't fit. Now this slide here, as it fills in, is showing, again, areas of anticipated population growth. Basically, the redder the area, these are some of the areas of, of anticipated high population growth, over the, at this point, next 15 years. And as you can see, I have circled some of the key areas that have either have or are going to have significant water supply issues. And again, notice that we're not just talking the Southwest, but we're talking about even places here in the East, and I mentioned before, even like the Pacific Northwest. And so, it's Florida is a ticking time bomb over there. Okay. I think this slide speaks for itself, so I'm not going to specifically focus on that. I've already, and I've commented on that. A couple of more slides related to areas that have had significant drought conditions. A lot of it is in the West, and if you overlay that with areas of high population growth, there's a pretty significant amount of overlap in a lot of those areas. Here's a recent drought monitor. This map actually looks pretty good relative to the way this Drought Monitor map from NOAA has looked in other times over the last couple of years. Last time I gave a presentation along these lines, there was one heck of a lot more red on the map even as compared to now, and a lot of it was in the southeast, and it was very strongly in the southwest. And as I recall, I think even here in Texas there was a lot of concern about drought here. Things have moderated a lot on a comparative basis, but but one of the big problems is, again, we don't have the infrastructure available. We don't have the ability to hold water on site in a region long enough to be able to use it and tide us over during those tough periods. Here's just an FYI on the seasonal drought outlook for the next about 3 months. And it's looking like the big area is going to be down in the southeast again. Now, traditionally, that's kind of a dry period anyway for the southeast, but because things have been running a bit on the dry side already, it's going to exacerbate the conditions down there. That's basically what this is indicating. And fortunately for the west, they've actually been getting some rain out there, both not only in the northwest, but in the even somewhat in the southwest. Okay. Conflicts and disputes, and as I mentioned, not in the west, but even in the east, the competition for water. We're seeing it all already, the litigation, negotiations, various agreements that all the states along the Colorado River have been battling for years and have tentative agreements put in place, but then litigation comes up, some enviro group sues, and it kind of upsets the apple cart, so they have to renegotiate things, and that a lot of the people that are getting screwed in the process of this are, and there's other dynamics to use the Colorado River as a good example, but agriculture is taking it on the chin to a very great extent, and there's also some regional dynamics like Southern California versus, say, Northern California, or Southern California versus other metropolitan areas, especially upstream along the Colorado River, and certainly within California itself, you have the Northern California versus Southern California issue, that is very heavily in play as well. So, and this is driving a lot of these areas in California. A lot of the cities, especially in Southern California, but even in the east, like Tampa, the city of Tampa, they're coming online with large desalination plants that they're actually desalinating seawater, and this was unheard of. I mean, yeah, it's one thing if we're talking Saudi Arabia, which has no water, so yeah, they'll do that, but this was never heard of before. Folks, this is where we are today, and again, we need to start planning this thing out. The good old days are ending. It is a finite commodity, and a lot of the fights that we hear in Washington are various communities basically competing and looking for the attention and wanting to get the upper hand on the water availability, and it all really comes down to economic development and sustainability for the existing people and existing industries that are in the areas, and be it the Charlotte, North Carolina area, be it Atlanta and the Georgia, Alabama, Florida disputes that have been going on, be it the Colorado River, just to name a few of them, and there's a bunch of others that we've been hearing about. It's all these same kinds of issues. It all boils down to economic development and being able to have a sustainable economy in that particular region. And again, a lot of what we're hearing is that the agricultural interests are more and more losing out. And where are we headed? It's definitely a new paradigm, as I've already been alluding to, that water is not limitless, and I want to, specifically, again, point out the bottom bullet on this slide here: recognizing basic ecosystem needs for water. The environmental activists that have been suing on this have been winning, and that is taking another slice out of the water allocation pie in many river basins. So beware. And again, who's taking it on the chin? Agricultural interests, first and foremost. And where do we need to go? This is where the academic community, I feel very grateful to be here and hearing about some of the things that the academic community is doing in the way of basic research. And I've had conversations with some folks this morning that, about are there ways of being able to better link some of the federal research interests and ultimately dollars, of course, to the work that's being done at academic institutions. One of the important things that I need to stress is that the academic community in general and individual schools also need to do a better job of selling the assets you have, including the knowledge assets, the research assets, and how the academic community can fill in a very, very important role, both on the water resource quantity side as well as on the water quality side. And a lot of the remaining kinds of issues, which we'll talk about in a moment, are related to quality types of issues, to talk on the quality side, the Federal Environmental Protection Agency once had a very, very large research arm to it. It had a bunch of laboratories around the country doing a lot of basic research. That has diminished tremendously over the last 20, 25 years. When I started my career, when I got out of graduate school and before going to law school, I was at the EPA in Washington, and I dealt pretty extensively with a lot of the research laboratories around the country. And so I saw a lot of the kind of work that they were doing back then, and that capacity has diminished tremendously. And the unfortunate thing is that the agency is not benefiting from as much as it could be from the kind of work that is going on in academic institutions like here. And that is, again, extremely important. The word has to get out. It's partly salesmanship in a sense. I don't want that to sound pejorative, and I don't mean it that way. But it's better selling of the valuable services and knowledge that that academic institutions have to offer. And in order to make your legislators, your congressmen, your senators, and also your state legislators, make them more aware of the kind of resources that they do have available. Again, I can't stress that enough. And this touches upon just some of the points that that are so important, and that I have actually talked with. I've enjoyed the meetings that I've had this morning with people, everybody here, at the university, and gee, it touches upon a lot of the things that I have listed on this table here. Let me move on. I could talk for hours about this. Okay, we need better planning. But there's a fine line, and I was saying to some folks this morning, there's a fine line, however, on the federal role in these kinds of planning efforts. People, and the voice becomes louder and louder as you head further west in the U.S., that what is the appropriate federal role in water resources planning, and because there's a very, very strong feeling, and especially as you head west, that water resources is a state issue, it's a property rights issue, and feds keep the hell out of it. We've heard stronger than what I just said, okay? Okay. And I mean, it is just it's passionate. People are passionate about their water. However, it's important that the planning be done, and that there is a role in, I think, in some instances, for the federal government especially in the area of technical assistance and resource assistance. I think we have some valuable research that some of our federal water agencies can provide a bigger perspective on, especially when you're dealing with regional kinds of issues that are very much interstate in issue. But that's not to say that the feds should be dictating what the states should be doing. I'm not even implying that. But right now, everything is just stymied, certainly at the federal level, of doing anything further. And if anything, budgets have been getting whittled down from year to year, where there's less and less resources being made available to the states and to the locals to be able to do these kinds of things, to help them out, and both in terms of the technical assistance as well as with the resources needed to help, frankly, construct some of the kinds of infrastructure we're talking about, and that's all the more reason why it's really important for the states to be stepping up. And again, Texas was one of the early ones, and still one of the only ones to really be trying to step up and trying at least to deal with this problem in a pretty strong fashion. And I guess it remains to be seen at the end of the day on how successful the effort will be, but at least something is happening here. I've already alluded to how water quantity issues are going to be driving water quality issues, to the extent that we have waters that are polluted from whatever the source of certainly man-made pollution is. That is going to be driving increasingly the water quality programs that we hear about under that are under the Federal Clean Water Act as implemented down in the states. And here it is. I wanted to point out, briefly on water quality issues. Let me run through a few statistics here from recent water quality assessment that EPA has prepared. This is on their website, and this is based upon state water quality reporting that they provide to the EPA. Based upon the latest assessment, now I should point out, this is based upon assessed waters, not all waters, and generally we're talking about a quarter to a third of these types of waters having been assessed during this last reporting period. And this is the latest snapshot over the course of, I think it's about a 4-year reporting period of information. However, when you look at the previous report that came out reviewing an earlier window of time that has looked at separate groups of waters for the most part, most of the statistics are actually fairly close to this. And as you can see, roughly half of the rivers and streams are in some fashion impaired, and meaning that they are not meeting all of their water quality standards that have been set for those particular waters. You can see the statistics for lakes and also for bays and estuaries. We're talking about significant percentages. This certainly is on the radar screen of the regulators. This is certainly on the radar screen of the activist groups that are increasingly filing citizen suits to try to get the regulators and the regulated community to try to address some of these problems. You can see some of the kinds of sources of impairments or activities that are identified as causing these sorts of problems. And agricultural activities, I hate to say it, is it's one of the major issues that is being identified in those impaired streams and lakes and all, and that there are some of these others, you know, the hydro modifications and so on and so forth, which I'm not minimizing. And when you get into more urban suburban areas and downstream from there, the municipal discharges and especially the sewer overflows issue, major problem still. And the big problem in solving that issue with a lot of these urban areas where they have combined sewer overflows, for example, is again, it goes to the issue of aging infrastructure and combined sewers that either you have to separate them or to do something else to try to deal with these kinds of problems. One of the things that a lot of urban areas that are looking at these days, there's the talk about quote-unquote green infrastructure. You know, the rain gardens to try to increase the amount of rainwater infiltration into the ground rather than having it running off either into combined sewers or otherwise running off and washing pollutants from the ground surface into these urban and suburban types of streams, creating pollution problems. The green infrastructure issue is real big. I've been talking to folks today, you know, about this issue a lot. And you know, the big questions in, I think, gaining widespread acceptance of various means of green infrastructure are, number one, you know, what is the effectiveness both up front and then down the road, you know, the effectiveness of these kinds of technologies and approaches, and number two, the issue of cost. And that's both in terms of, say, the upfront capital costs as well as what I'll characterize as the O&M or the operating and maintenance costs, that, you know, as you go through time. And are they effective? Are these approaches effective? Are they not effective? And looking at it in not just in isolation, but looking at maybe hybridized approaches of dealing with some of these problems. And one of the things that certainly a lot of you know, local officials look at is comparing a green infrastructure approach versus a so-called traditional gray infrastructure approach, you know, using the sewers and so on. And so these are, you know, these are some of the issues that are lurking out there, and frankly, the regulators and the regulated community, you know, a lot of municipal officials I think are very open to embracing these kinds of techniques. Is just that they don't have a lot of information on it at this point in time. And certainly, you know, we at the federal level, including you know, the legislators, us, you know, at, like, say, in Congress, we have a lot of the same questions, and I think are very open to embracing these kinds of approaches. Just need to learn more about it, and it's been extremely difficult to get this information. You know, more concrete information about it all. This briefly identifies some of the major types of pollutants, and the nutrients and sediment are biggies. Pathogens, you know, like E. coli, you know, from some of it is from things like combined sewer overflows, but a fair amount of it is either from wildlife, believe it or not, and you know, Bambi running through the woods, and there's a fair amount of it also because of animal agriculture. So these are, again, some of the kinds of issues that are lurking out there. And it's these kinds of issues that I'm pointing to that, again, are going to be driving the regulators to be clamping down in the future, and it's happening now, folks, on trying to deal with these kinds of water quality problems. And again, it's not just the regulators, but it is also the activist groups filing citizen suit after citizen suit. I read about new lawsuits almost every week being filed someplace to try to go after a farmer, or go after a municipality, or go after whomever, to try to deal with you know, a lot of these kinds of impairments that are being talked about. And I indicate here who some of the target sectors include, and agriculture has a big bullseye on its back, I hate to say it, along with municipalities. And I certainly indicate some of the others here as well, that I'm not trying to minimize those. the big issues that are out there, nutrients. Sediment's going to be another one. There's a big push for numerical water quality criteria for nutrients. There was a lawsuit in Florida, and EPA is moving forward with trying to promulgate numerical water quality standards for the state of Florida. That's only the tip of the iceberg. The enviros are looking to sue other states and have this ultimately happen nationally. So beware. These are some of the issues here. There's a big push on for impaired waters to get total maximum daily load calculations done to try to limit the amount of loadings that are being introduced into these impaired waters. There's litigation and also been legislative proposals to expand NPDES permitting. A lot of you have heard about the push to require NPDES permits for the use of pesticides near waters. And with EPA now writing regulations and a general permit to ostensibly deal with that issue, unfortunately they're only halfway dealing with the issue, and it's going to lead to a lot more controversy in the future. So stay tuned on that. That issue has not gone away. And we're going to be seeing more and more of this, including the desire to require every landowner, every farmer, even for your own home. This is where it could end up. If you want to put fertilizer on your front yard in your house, okay, and I'm not even talking about your agricultural field, okay, but in your own house, if you want to fertilize your front yard, you may need to have an NPDES permit. That's where the environmental the real activist types want to go, and that there's a need on the part of Congress to try to rein this in, and these kinds of pollution sources are not suitable for requiring everybody to be getting permits. There needs to be a different approach to dealing with these sorts of issues, and unfortunately, many in Congress have not been willing to engage in that discussion to try to come up with a better way. We'll see what happens next year. I'm going to mention briefly the fiscal factors, and I'm almost done here. The fiscal factors, money is going to be tight, folks, until we get this deficit under control. And I can assure you, if the House of Representatives flips to Republican control, and even more so if it happens in the Senate as well, we're going to be seeing tightening budgets. And money is going to be even tighter than what it might seem even today. And down the road, there's going to be this dynamic tension, as I've been alluding to all throughout, on these jurisdictional issues of, what role should the federal government be playing versus states and locals and the private citizens in dealing with a lot of these problems. A lot of people still live by the paradigm of having a strong top-down federal, heavy-handed federal approach versus the, what I'll call the bottom-up approach toward, a more inclusive kind of approach to having the states and the locals, have the lead on dealing with these issues and getting buy-in by the stakeholders. It's going to continue to be, controversial, and it's going to be a very tough thing, especially if we continue to not do much of anything in this country on all of these issues, both on the quantity as well as the quality side. And with that, I'm going to end it, I think, right here. And I guess Ben Franklin expressed it very nicely and consistent, I think, with the whole theme, to put it in sort of economic terms. With that, I will stop, and let me throw it open to questions.
We do have about 4 minutes, so we have some time for some quick questions. Joe?
Are you aware of any place in the U.S. where water is rationed?
I'm going to answer that as indirectly yes, not as directly as I think what you have quite in mind, but I know that I have talked to many, for example, irrigation districts. And they ration the amount of water. They use various types of techniques, either based upon acreage or based upon maybe the kind of activity that they're engaged in, or they might use some kind of pricing factors otherwise to help to ration the water. In other instances, there are requirements for people to get permits from the state, and this is usually handled by states, to get a withdrawal permit for either ground or surface water. And there's usually a minimum threshold for that, so what I'll use the term de minimis users don't have to, but more and more what I've been seeing in a lot of states is that the de minimis threshold has been getting lower and lower, so that if you have any kind of appreciable desire for withdrawing water, either from surface or ground, that you need to apply for a permit, and it is not necessarily a slam dunk that you're going to get that permit, because what the Water Resources Agency will do in that state is they will look at all the competing other uses and do what I'll call a sustainability evaluation to see if it is going, is there enough water in that surface water body, including looking during drought periods, or look at the aquifer if it's a draw from groundwater, and they'll say yes or no. And I'm not just talking about out west, but I've seen it as close as in like state of Maryland and state of the Commonwealth of Virginia.
I meant the homeowner, the public buying homeowners.
Individual homeowners, I have not really seen that so far in the way of anything mandatory of rationing. The closest thing to that is trying to get push people to more efficient uses, like having some metropolitan areas, they have been paying people to change out their toilets, for example, for more efficient, the low flush toilets.
Or making them pay fees if they water the lawn.
And also another issue is pricing structure. A lot of cities used to never even have water meters, so people could use whatever water they wanted. New York City is a good example of that. And more they're metering up the city, and more and more metropolitan area, utilities are developing pricing structures that do not encourage high amounts of water usage, but it's the other way around, where the price, instead of going down with quantity, will go up with quantity, especially in the residential area. So we're seeing a lot of that happening. So it's those kinds of mechanisms more than the direct rationing, you can't use more than 50 gallons a day type of thing.
In Lebanon, where I'm from, we get 2 hours of water, running water a day. So every apartment or house has a tank,
yep.
And you use what's in that tank.
Yeah, that would sober up people in this country if it came to that. And is it going to mean that we have to go to that? I don't know. I don't know. Time will tell.